The first session is about repository networks. So moving away from this environment where there are many, many distributed repositories across the world, which is fine because repositories began as institutional services. But as we know, the environment is changing around open science policies. We're moving away from the idea that we can just transition the current system over to open access and open science, but we need to maybe think about redesigning the infrastructure and the publishing environment. And repositories are a very important part of the landscape for advancing open science. But it's very hard to do that when there are no mechanisms for bringing repositories together. So one of the things that CORE has had on our priority list is to try to nurture and encourage the development of repository networks, either at the national level or the regional level, depending on what part of the world you're in and the jurisdiction. And so today we will start with a session about So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Martha Whitehead. She is the core person of CORE, the chairperson of CORE, the chairperson of CORE. She's the vice provost of Harvard University Library. And she's also the chair of a very new group in the United States called the U.S. Repository Network. And so, Martha, please, I turn the floor over to you.
Kathleen, thank you everybody for being here. I think that would be okay. That would be okay. That's okay. If I can't read it, you can pull up a computer. All right. All right. I'll get started. So when Kathleen had put together the program and she put me as the first speaker on this panel, I at first said, I don't think that's right, because in fact, the US is building on what many other regions of the world have done before us. And that is really building a robust sense of repositories and repository network. But then I thought, well, I can go first as the chair of the CORE Executive Board and sort of paint. Oh, sorry. Okay. This is a 15-minute presentation if I go at my normal speed. But I will try and slow down. Thank you. Okay, so I will give you a little bit of the context and then talk about why we are doing a U.S. repository network and our emerging priorities in that network. Carla, how am I not advancing? Sorry. This advanced before. Oh, here we go. Okay. All right. So it's the lower one that works. Okay. Sorry. All right. So in terms of context, This is, I think, familiar to all of you, but I thought it was a good place to start. And it builds on the remarks that Eloy made yesterday that I thought were so great about the context of the Notify project and what we're trying to achieve. And this steps back a little bit further from how we were thinking before the Notify project about really what we are all aiming to do together. And that is to have open, inclusive, and equitable scholarly communications. So we want all valuable research outputs to be openly available as possible, as early as possible, and included in research evaluation processes. So as early as possible, as in repositories are a birthplace for the scholarly communication system. And then trust, we heard about the Notify project being so important in terms of connecting peer review services to the repository layer. So definitely we want that in our ecosystem. We want no costs for readers to access or authors to publish, and we want reasonable, transparent costs for services and infrastructure. And I think many of us are seeing the repository landscape as incredibly important for this, and as in contrast, for example, to our article processing charges. We want to support diversity of perspectives and inclusion of all regions and their local control of assets. Repositories, of course, play an important role in that, as we've seen in the Global South and all parts of the world. We want representative community governance, and that means that it is within the scholarly community's control. And of course, we want, as a foundational element of this, fair and care principles. So the context for this session was the initiative that Kathleen mentioned of CORE launching a strategy to modernize the global repository network. Kathleen mentioned yesterday that she has been questioned about the word modernize, and my ears perked up at that because I've had the same questions in my own university context. We are revising our strategic plan, and we had a goal that was named, it was called Modernize Our Digital Infrastructure. And I had advice from an external group that I have, an external advisory group, somebody who works in the US government said, it's dangerous to use the word modernize because it gives the impression that it's something that you do once and then you're modern and then you're done and you no longer need any funding for this. So I thought that was really good advice, and also just thought about the fact that we are continually evolving in our landscape, that we want to be innovative and cutting edge all the time. And that is just a continual process. And I thought also it means investment. So, those are, and there's probably other good words that we should come up with, and we'll continue to think about that. So in the US context, I'm sure you've all heard about the OSTP memo. So this is from the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. And we were very excited to have this come out in August of 2022. It's about ensuring free, immediate, and equitable access to federally funded research. And it builds on the 2013 memo on increasing access to the results of federally funded research. The memo, the 2022 memo from last summer noted that there's this primary limitation of the 2013 memo was the optional 12-month embargo from public access of any publication resulting from federally funded research. So it was really great to see that called out and to see the statement that, no, we have to be faster. We must allow all Americans to benefit from the returns on our research and development investments without delay. And I thought it was also significant that there's an acknowledgement that this isn't just about the US environment, it's about being a critical leader and partner on issues of open science around the world. So that was very reassuring. In terms of peer-reviewed scholarly publications, there was this statement that they are to be made freely available and publicly accessible by default in agency-designated repositories without any embargo or delay after publication. So it was wonderful to see that emphasis on repositories. And of course, we're very interested in what agency designated will end up meaning. On the surface, it means things like PubMed from NIH, but we're hoping that we can influence a much broader understanding of the repository landscape. And then for scientific data, it's the idea of it being freely available and publicly accessible by default at the time of publication. And you'll note that it refers to what the digital repositories need to look like with this mention of the desirable characteristics of data repositories for federally funded research. And then the mention of public access plans is important. The idea that we are going to have to indicate specific online digital repository or repositories where the researcher expects to deposit their relevant data consistent with the federal agency's guidelines. So lots of really wonderful stuff for us to build on in all of this. And in Kathleen's summary of this, what we were supposed to talk about in this session, she had observed that repositories are having a moment. And so I thought it's just very true. And of course, we hope it's not just a moment, that it's actually, you know, the building of a momentum, and that we will see this continuing emphasis. But I quoted it because I also am very aware that it's a complicated moment. And in the United States, it's wonderful that there's now this embracing of the sense of, yes, of course, repositories are an important part of this landscape, but it does mean that there are many players for us to be aware of. And I just have one example here of an NIH initiative called the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative. And this is a quote of their mission of establishing a common set of cohesive and consistent capabilities, services, metrics, and social infrastructures across various generalist repositories. That sounds great. That's what we want to do as well. And then just to raise awareness and adopt FAIR principles. So very, very similar. We're in conversations with them. You'll notice all the different things they want to do in terms of objectives, including committing to co-opetition. So there's definitely a commercial element in this landscape as well. So not exactly what we're trying to do within the core context, but very, very related, and we all have to work together. It's very much a deep ecosystem. Okay, so why a US repository network? When CORE launched the initiative that we've just been talking about, there was the survey in 2021 that we could look at by regions, and the US members identified these issues: institutional silos, so no coordination across the country. And for me, coming into the United States from Canada several years ago, I really was struck by the different environment of working in such a large and very diverse country. So different politics in different regions, different perceptions of the right way to approach things. It's very hard to get a cohesive sense of how, as a region, people would like to approach scholarly communications. And then there's just the sense that repositories have been sort of below the radar, a lack of visibility and recognition amongst other stakeholders. And then several people just talked about the basic issues at their institutions of underfunding for repository operations. You know, it feels like often the repositories still do feel like that. I think Eloy used the term graveyard, you know, like that's what you do later, and we have to reposition them to be a starting point. And just some very practical things of needing to upgrade versions of software. So you've all heard this in your regions as well. But I think essentially, as well as sort of what the repository managers were thinking about, we really need to focus on what we're hearing from our researchers. And, you know, researchers often have the perception that all of this is just a compliance issue. It's about, I need to, you know, tick a box to be able to get my grant. We'd really like it to feel more like a really useful imperative for their research. This is going to make your research better. They have trouble choosing a repository. There's problems with the metadata processes, and we just really basically need to improve curation and preservation. So all of that means that we need to invest in and promote best practices in all repositories, and that's what we want to do in the US repository network. So the USRN is a partnership of SPARC, which I'm sure you are all aware of, and CORE, and I won't stop to spend time reading their mandates, but just so you know, it's a partnership. And I just wanted to point out that we have had lots of great partnerships with SPARC in the past. For example, the Good Practice Principles for Scholarly Communication Services. So what we did first with USRN was to develop a vision. And so this was a 63-member group of core members, SPARC steering committee members, various library leaders, repository managers, consortium leaders. We had input from the Coalition of Open Access Policy Institutions, OpenCon librarians, and then we had an open call for public comment. And we arrived at this strategic vision for US repositories. An interoperable network of repositories is an essential component of our national research infrastructure, offering rapid and open access to research, and plays a crucial role in collective efforts to transform global research communications, leading to a more open, inclusive, and equitable system. So I'm sure you see that resonates with the core thinking. We want USRN to be an inclusive network. So this means repositories that are dealing with all sorts of content, not just publications, but data, code, gray literature, various emerging forms of scholarship. They could be hosted by higher education institutions, research centers, or other nonprofit organizations, and they could use open source or vended platforms. I won't take the time to read these foundational characteristics. They'll be familiar to all of you, but I just wanted to include them in the slides as future reference if you want to come back and look at them. And we have a great steering group with different members in different kinds of roles in different institutions across the country. And I wanted to give a shout out, especially to Vicki Coleman, who's the co-chair with me. Vicki is at North Carolina A&T State University. That's one of our historically Black colleges and universities. So it's a really nice compliment that we have Vicki from a small, not well-funded university and me from a large, well-funded university. And I think having those two perspectives at the table is really, really important. And also I'd like to thank Tina Bache, our Spark Visiting Program Officer, for really coordinating all the work of USRN. So the kinds of things we've been working on. First of all, of course, we see a need to really support the OSTP memo and the federal agencies' policies that are emerging from that. And so what we've done there is work on desirable characteristics of digital publication repositories. You'll remember I mentioned there was desirable characteristics for data. And so we're contributing this for publications. And of course, we drew on the core community framework and other thoughts about what makes a good publication repository. And then this is a bit of a shift that I'm seeing in the US landscape. It felt to me for years as though there really was a huge focus on APCs. And now we're seeing much more of this acknowledgement that we need to find alternatives. So in USRN, we're pushing that. We're saying, for example, in this letter to NIH recently, ensuring ease of compliance through fast, free repository deposit mechanisms will provide an important channel to help eliminate the need for such expensive, unsustainable fees. And then recently we've started talking about how we're thinking about the buzz around generative AI, machine learning and generative AI. And I just pulled this from a memo that I'd written at Harvard just last week as I was working with our university administration on how we're thinking about generative AI in our campus landscape, because I just wanted to make sure that it's understood, what our role is. And I thought it was just interesting to think about generative AI and research libraries sharing this fundamental promise that the ability to draw on a broad corpus of existing information to answer questions and generate new information. So that's why we're interested in this landscape. And in this equation, Harvard Library brings the fundamental value of access to information. But by that, we mean access to trustworthy information spanning centuries, regions, and voices around the globe. So this is, of course, Harvard language, but I think it's relevant for all of us here today as well. And then we have really been emphasizing open repositories in everything we do. And we're saying that they're critical for providing trustworthy content for the development of reliable generative AI tools. As well, we need to influence these tools to be globally inclusive, as early models tend to reflect the existing bias towards research outputs of the global north. So this is a conversation we just started having in the USRN. Not sure where we're going to take it yet, but we think that it's just an important contribution as I'm very interested in how we'll be moving forward in core with our thinking about machine learning as well. Then the other thing, a big thing, is sort of underscoring equity. So we are finding that there are misunderstandings about the repository landscape in the US. Some people think that, well, we don't need a generalist repository because everybody has a repository. But as I, said, Tina, for example, or Vicki, my co-chair, is at a very small institution running a repository software that she doesn't necessarily think might be the best option. And so she's looking for other opportunities. There's many researchers who are looking for opportunities. So we just have to keep that in mind, that what we're trying to achieve here is equity in the landscape. So I'll leave you with this thought. One of the first things we did in our work with the US Repository Network was just to think about how we wanted to advocate. And that's one of the main points. Now, we had an interesting conversation in our last steering group meeting about the word network. And some people interpret network as meaning we're going to build something, we're going to build infrastructure, technology. And so there was a thought, well, should we just call it a collective or a collaboration? But we thought, no, that sounds too loose and it doesn't sound like action. So we are sticking with network, and we're trying to emphasize all these points I have here. And essentially, they're all about influencing investment. So we want to emphasize this issue of no single point of failure. We don't want to be in that landscape that we are in with scholarly publications. We want to make sure that we have a diverse ecosystem. We want local infrastructure and services that promote equity, as I mentioned. We want multiple types of repositories to meet varying needs. So nobody is saying that we have the one great repository to win them all. And that also to emphasize institutional repositories. We are generalist repositories in our institutional repositories, and that they're fast and affordable. And then because institutional repositories are mainly hosted by universities and research centers, we are deeply embedded in the research mission. And finally, investment in open infrastructure and expertise at local institutions can be leveraged to ensure curation and adoption of good practices. So think about us embedded in our research organizations. Of course, we can help advance this landscape. So those are the key messages that USRN is working on, and hope that we can update you on other initiatives in the future. Thank you. And there's more information.